In today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement, we're going to be talking about a tough topic and one of my least favorite parts of the tax code, including, but also one of the worst parts of life in general is losing your spouse. And so we're specifically going to talk to those who are widowed today, or we're going to be talking to those who are single because those are going to have the same type of disadvantages of those who are widowed. But we're also going to be talking about those who maybe you're married but planning on potentially being a widow in the future. And so that could consist of maybe your spouse is older, maybe your spouse is in not as good of health, or maybe you just never know what can happen and you want to think ahead, which is what we encourage many of our clients to do. But we're specifically going to talk to that type of person who just is maybe widowed and coming out of that, and what are some of the things that they need to be thinking about, knowing how hard it is to deal with the emotional side of the death of a loved one. We're going to try to help on focus on the financial side, talk about some of the things to make sure you're aware of that can become more of a concern, but more importantly, how are we going to make sure that those concerns are not necessarily an issue moving forward. So hopefully you enjoy today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement.
Joe knows taxes.
Joe knows the market.
Joe knows Social Security.
Joe knows income planning.
Joe knows pickleball? No.
This is Joe Knows Retirement.
Before we get into anything, I want to just share a personal story on my end. And I actually just lost my uncle not too long ago, and it was a very emotional time. And my uncle was the first client I had when I got into financial planning. So I always tell people, if it wasn't for my Uncle Chuck, then none of this would be existing. There'd be no Joe Knows Retirement. We'd have no peak retirement planning. I wouldn't be probably as successful if it wasn't for people trusting me early on with their life savings when I was 22 years old, right out of college, with no reason to, other than the fact that they knew I was just going to work as hard as I could for them, ensure they got exactly what they needed. And a lot of people couldn't tell them that because maybe the advisors they were with currently are just not as didn't care as much at that time. And so that's something that my Uncle Chuck told me when he wasn't doing too well. It was actually December of 2022, and I'll never forget it. He told me two things. He said, one, he said, Joe, always trust the young guy. He said, I've always heard that. He said, I've always believed that in my work. He was a plumber and pipe fitter, so he had a pension, and he was that Midwestern millionaire that we always talk about. He was a diligent saver. He was a hard worker. He was very frugal. He had five kids. My aunt, his wife, was a stay-at-home mom, and so they really were tight on money, but they did the right things, and they saved, and they were disciplined. And that was something I always looked up to with Uncle Chuck. And so he said, always trust a young guy. And he said, thank you for all that you've done to help us get to where we are, because I was able to show them that, hey, if you're no longer here, your wife is going to be fine financially. And then I remember the second thing he said, and it hits me to this day, and it's always going to mean something to him. And he pointed out his wife, and I'll never forget it. He said it very slow. He said, whatever you do, make sure she's taken care of. And I know that's the exact feeling that many spouses or widows here, that their husband or their wife, I'm sure, had that same type of feeling, that they wanted to make sure that they were set and didn't have any worries in the world. And that's why they were obviously married for that long and had that great of a marriage up to that point. And so if that's you today, obviously we're going to help you plan for this and make sure that you're good to go. And unfortunately, my uncle passed away at an early age, and so there's going to be a long retirement for my aunt ahead. And so I'm going to share some of the strategies too that we looked at with them before that time happened, but also after that we're looking at planning for here as well. So that's what we've gotten today in store for today of Joe Knows Retirement. So one of the biggest reasons why this is a disadvantage, let's just start off with some of the disadvantages, and the biggest one is the fact that you go from married filing jointly to single tax rates. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind, that if you pass away, if the spouse passed away, so for example, I'll use my Uncle Chuck as an example. He passed away in January of 2023. And so I remember sitting there with him when I told you that story in December. And I told you, I said, Uncle Chuck, all this is great, but if you can make it 2 more weeks, then you're going to leave your wife in a much better situation, because now we have the entire year of 2023 to do tax planning. And I'll tell you what, my Uncle Chuck was a fighter and he loved his wife. And so what did he do? He made it to January 15th. And so because of that, we had more opportunity. Now, if he would have passed away in December, that would have been the last year of married filing jointly tax rates. And with it being the end of the year, it would have been harder to get things done from a tax planning standpoint. So we know he had terminal cancer earlier, so we could plan for that. But if we don't know that, then, if it's just a sudden death, then you could be December 30th, and now you're rushing to get things done in the last couple of years because you weren't expecting to only have that married filing jointly for that year moving forward. Now, if you have dependents, which there's not a lot of people who watch these videos because most of them are in or near retirement, but if you do have dependents and you are a widow, then make sure you understand the rules are different for you. So it's a 2-year rule versus the same year, and so you can have more opportunity to spread that out, take advantage of lower tax rates. Could be the consideration there. The other thing that can be considered, and then we'll go into the tax rates, but also if you are selling your house, you want to be aware of that too, because the tax exclusion, $250,000 and $500,000. If you're married filing jointly, then you'll be able to get the $500,000. If you're single, then it's $250,000. And so the unique rule with this primary residence is if you live there 2 out of the last 5 years, you can actually, for 2 years past the death, then you can actually get the $500,000 exclusion. So if you've lived somewhere for a long time and there's a huge capital gain event, which is similar to my aunt, she had a similar situation where they bought it for a lower amount. It's much more. If she would have just had the $250,000, maybe that's not enough to cover the capital gains. And so that's something most spouses, they downsize after the death and after the kids move out. That can make sense to make sure you look to do that a little sooner. Also, you hear the advice all the time that don't make financial decisions for at least a year after you lose your spouse. Yes and no. Can be good advice, but we just talked about, you can lose some opportunities if you wait too long. And I know it's burdensome, but that's why you want to try to get ahead of it. The key is just work with a team. Work with a team. We have so many people who come and work with us specifically because they want a team in case they pass away, someone to be there for their spouse. We also work with a lot of single females in itself as well, and it's a lot of times because they're looking for the help, they're looking for the guidance, they need a team to help them that's trusted for them to make the right decisions. They like the one-stop shop. That's also something I would recommend. If you are looking for a team to serve you, is make sure they do comprehensive planning. Don't go to an insurance salesperson. Don't go to a local shop or a nationwide firm that only does investment management. You could pay the same cost for a comprehensive team. So hopefully that can add some advice as you're looking for a team to trust you. Also decide, do you want to work with someone locally or someone virtually, right? I mean, like for example, with us, we work with clients all across the country. But we always ask them, like, hey, are you comfortable with a virtual relationship? Because if you want in person, we're not the best fit. You need to work with someone that you want to how do you want that relationship to look? Do you want someone who's going to be an older advisor, a younger advisor? Do you want a team or an individual? Those are all decisions to make that hopefully that you're considering when finding that team. That's why people, if you're married watching this, maybe you look to find that now, because typically one spouse is into it and one spouse isn't into it. And so if that one that's into it passed away, then that other spouse is going to be left in a disadvantaged situation, and so you want to plan ahead of that. So back to the tax situation, we talked about the primary residence. Also, most houses are owned jointly. It's going to depend on the state you live in too, if you're in a community property state. But if here in Ohio, for example, if you had all the assets, the house owned in one of the spouse's name, and that spouse passed, then it was TOD, transfer on death, to the other spouse, or maybe it was a trust that went to the other spouse, and you could get a full step up there, and that could be an advantageous thing to plan for on top of that married filing jointly $500,000 exclusion as well. So just understand how those rules work. Obviously, if you are widowed, then you want to make sure you have a transfer on death on your property if your state allows it, or if you have a trust, then that will avoid probate on your house to make sure it goes to the beneficiary. We've seen people pass away where it's just them and there's no one named after that spouse passed. So that's something, if you want to save your heir some money, make sure you have all the beneficiaries in place at that point. Also, when you lose a spouse, typically that spouse was the beneficiary. You want to make sure you update that on your IRAs, your 401ks, update your beneficiaries everywhere so that you don't have that be any issues where it has to go to probate, because we know with probate it's very costly and it takes a lot of time. So that's something you can get ahead of. So back to the tax situation though, of married filing jointly to single. The biggest issue with this is that a single spouse could pay nearly double the amount of taxes as married filing jointly, because that's how the tax rates work. Basically, if you're in the 22% bracket and you're married, you could be in the 12% if you're single. And so you also have your standard deduction, goes from $30,000 to $15,000. It could be a little more depending on your age and situation, but that's going to be significant. The first amount of money to you up front is not going to be as tax advantageous. And so, if you have a pension, for example, or you have $1 million or more saved, you're automatically, when you take money from those investments or that pension that comes in, you're going to be forced into higher brackets sooner than if you were married in that situation. So that's a big concern we see a lot of people worried about. I'll say the other concern is worrying about things, such as Social Security, knowing that you lose one of the two, And so with this, if your spouse was receiving $4,000, but your benefit was $2,000, maybe you never worked and you received the spousal benefit, which is half. Well, now yours would go away. That $2,000 would go away, and then you would only be able to take that $4,000. So you're going to have a loss of income. And even with that loss of income, we still see that people pay more in taxes because that's how disadvantaged that single tax rate environment is. And then you also want to make sure you're planning not only for Social Security, but also the pension, and knowing what is that going to look like. Are you going to be receiving 100% of that? Obviously there's an election that had to be made at that time, and not everyone elects that full survivorship option because you have to pay for it each year. And it's something that, we don't even always recommend clients take that at times because it can be so costly. It's always going to depend on the situation, what the client's needs and goals are. But maybe if you don't have that, you have some life insurance that's going to pay out. We know that life insurance pays out tax-free. And so that could be a lump sum of money that you now need to turn into a plan or income, knowing that that can cover some of the lost income for maybe a pension or Social Security. It is all things that we need to plan for. And so, those are the considerations of those type of things. Also, understand that you are potentially eligible to start receiving Social Security at 60 as a widow. So I'm not sure your age that you're watching this, but could be an opportunity for you to get one of the Social Security benefits at 60, delay the others until 70. We've seen a lot of clients do that. So make sure you're working with Social Security Administration to see what your benefit is and what opportunities there are. That's something we do with all of our clients when that time comes, to make sure they're maximizing the benefits and not leaving any money on the table. And so that could be a situation there for you to consider. Now, another couple concerns to be aware of is when it comes to taxation on that Social Security like we just talked about, and also Medicare premiums could cost more as well. So with single, you're going to have more of a likelihood of that income causing your Social Security to become more taxable. So with Social Security, it could be tax-free, or up to 85% of it could count as income. A lot of times when we see a widow, a lot of times they're going to be paying the majority of that 85% is going to be taxable, especially if they have a pension or they have $1 million plus saved up. They're going to likely have to take withdrawals and force themselves over that amount. And so that could be something that you want to make sure you're aware of, that you may have less income, not only from having less Social Security, but also having less because some of it could go to taxes depending on how your situation was before that. The other thing is Medicare tiers. So now your Medicare tiers for married, filing jointly, it gets cut in half if you're single. And so now you can have more of a likelihood of paying more for Medicare. Now, that's only going to apply to you at 65, although you have to be aware that that looks back 2 years. So when you're 63, your income at that point is going to determine your 65 Medicare premium that you're going to have to pay. So just be aware of that. And just know that you may have to pay more for healthcare, but you get the same coverage as everyone else. So again, all of these things are misfortunate and unfortunate, but the good news is that we can start planning and doing things now to make sure that we're planning ahead of this, knowing that this is going to be a disadvantage. Whether you are a recent widow, or maybe you're preparing to potentially be a widow, or maybe you are single, then that's all going to apply to you, as some of what we're going to talk about here next. And so to make things a little more maybe not happier, because we're going to be talking about estate planning, and that can mean when you pass away, but I do want to talk about the impact and opportunity that you may have at that point as well. Now you're going to be able to leave an impact to maybe your beneficiaries, which may be your children, or maybe a charity, or maybe those close to you. And so this is where we'd start to really encourage you to think about, what do you want this legacy to look like? Again, most people watching our YouTube channel have pensions, $1 million plus. They're going to be in a great financial situation. That's the real thing that I want to make clear for those watching this video, is that if you are in that situation, that 2% club situation we talk about with a pension, which less than 20% of people have, and $1 million, so that's less than 10% of people have, then you're probably going to be fine financially, is what we typically see. And I can tell you, this is one of my favorite parts with the crowd we work with in that situation, is we tell them, like, hey, here's the numbers. Everything looks good. Like, you're good. You don't have to worry at this point moving forward. And it's just like, you just see tears flow, because I remember having a client, they just talked about how, I knew he would take care of me. I knew he would take care of me. And it's sure enough, like, she has more money than she knows what to do with at this point. We're actually starting to have more conversations of, hey, if you don't do anything, you're going to be leaving millions of dollars behind. Do you want to spend more? Do you want to gift more to beneficiaries now and children now, and it can mean more than later? Do you want to give more to the charities that you guys have been giving to all these years in honor of your husband, and even as well, because her husband was very involved in those charities? And so, it's the type of impact that can be really, really advantageous if you do it the right way. But if you just wait until you pass, still can be an impact. It's just a matter of you're not going to be able to see it, or you're not going to be able to guide it as much. For example, if you give to your kids or charities now, you get to see if they're worth to have the money ongoing, right? You know, I don't want to make it sound like a negative, but like you get to see, are they going to use it valuable to your values? And if so, maybe you give more, maybe you give less if they're not. And so this gives you the opportunity to try with it. And as we know, a generous heart is typically going to give you more joy. And so that's something that maybe something you consider there now that you have this opportunity. But the first key there is always run your numbers, see what it looks like, see if this is even an opportunity for you to do this, because it may not. You may not be in as good of a financial situation to be able to do that. And so we really ask that you do that first before you make that decision. And then make sure, again, we've talked about all the updating the beneficiaries, but also make sure you have updated estate planning documents at this point. You know, maybe you have your husband as, or your wife as the power of attorney, or maybe you have it as, you know, all of the, you know, in the trust document, you need to update that. So just make sure you have everything ran and looked at and make sure everything is in good place. And you should be updating your estate planning documents every 3 to 5 years, or at least getting them checked just to make sure everything's in place and everything's how you want it there. So those are some of the considerations. Now, some of the strategies we really want to look at this point is, you know, things like a Roth conversion. So if you're watching this and you are married still, again, utilizing that Roth conversion, that's what we did with my uncle when he was in poor health, is we really looked to expedite his Roth conversions, knowing it was going to go to single tax brackets, knowing his wife was going to get 100% of his pensions. And so that's something that we plan for there. And so, you know, if you're single now, you may be thinking, well, now I'm more disadvantageous. Well, that's probably going to be the case for time moving forward. And your tax situation is probably not going to get better the older you get, because again, RMDs are going to start at 73, 75. That's when you're required to take out money from your tax deferred vehicles. That's when you also at 63, Medicare starts to become a factor, as we talked about. You know, at 62 to 70, or even 60, when you take Social Security, now you have to worry about taxation for that. So maybe you're in your 50s, or maybe you're in your early 60s. Could be an opportunity to look at things like that. Do it now before all those things collide in the future. And potentially people think tax rates will be higher in the future. We have no idea what tax rates will be. They could be higher, lower, the same, but helps to have that diversification, especially knowing most people have their money in tax deferred. And so simple idea of a Roth is you take that tax deferred money, your IRA, your 401k, your 403b, TSP, whatever you may have there. Maybe you look to pay taxes on some of that now, typically not all of it, but pay some of it now so you can move it to, you know, a Roth where it can grow tax-free moving forward. So you just have to run the numbers to see if that's going to make sense. So one is, should you do it? Two is, in how much? That's where it gets difficult, is trying to optimize that. Highly encourage you to work with some software, work with a team who understands that level of planning so that you're doing it the right way, certainly. But those are some of the things that we would consider. So if that's you, those are, you know, some things you definitely want to look at. But just understand too, like, you don't have to go at this alone. You can find a trusted team who's going to act in your best interest, who's going to be able to do this for you. And if you were looking for help, whether, you know, you're not ready to trust a team yet or not, you know, just let us know how we can help you. We've got plenty of resources on this channel. If you like this video and it was helpful for you today, hopefully this can be helpful as you plan moving forward. If you want to request one of my books, and you can go to our website, we'll be glad to send you out one. Or if you think you want to schedule a time with us to explore working with us, or maybe you're just saying, hey, I need help, and you guys seem to help these types of people, we certainly do. If you have $1 million more, you have a pension, you've got a higher income that you're expecting in retirement, higher net worth, we call them the Midwestern millionaires. If that's you, feel free to reach out to us. And if we can personally help you, we will. And if it's a good fit, and if not, then we'll at least guide you in the right direction to make sure you're not just wandering, or, you know, wondering if you're going to be good or not, or what you should be doing. So hopefully we can be a resource there. In the link below, you'll see a link to schedule a time. And again, you know, sorry for your loss if this is something that you lost a spouse, and this is something you're watching this video for that. If that's not you, then make sure you're planning ahead of this and making sure you're getting ahead of some of the things we talked about here today. So that's all I've got on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement. Thanks for watching.